Okay, guys. So this is the third and final recording for the respiratory system, and it is going to be on gas exchange. So pulmonary ventilation only brings new air into and removes oxygen-poor air from the alveoli. That's the process of ventilation. During pulmonary gas exchange, this is when the actual respiratory gases, oxygen and CO2, oxygen will diffuse from the air in the alveoli to blood in the pulmonary capillaries, and carbon dioxide will flow in the opposite direction. This is what we call gas exchange, is that exchange of these respiratory gases. There are two processes that are involved in gas exchange. Pulmonary gas exchange involves the exchange of gases between the alveoli and the blood, and then tissue gas exchange involves the exchange of gases between the blood and systemic capillaries and the body cells. Now, in order to look at this, we need to look at some behaviors that gas properties exhibit. And an important factor that affects gas exchange is the pressure that a gas exerts on its solubility in water are important for driving pulmonary and tissue gas exchange. And there are two laws that govern this, Dalton's law and Henry's law. Dalton's law essentially states that each gas in a mixture exerts its own pressure, and this is called partial pressure of that particular gas. Now, the total pressure of the gas mixture is the sum of the partial pressures of all of the component gases, and that should actually each equal atmospheric air. So if we look at atmospheric air, where it's made up of oxygen, nitrogen, and a few other things, if you look at the percentage composition of nitrogen in the atmosphere, which is 78%, you would take 760, which is atmospheric pressure. 78% of that would be 593 millimeters of mercury. And that would be the particular partial pressure of nitrogen that's being exerted on a system here. Oxygen, which is 21% of atmospheric air, the partial pressure would be 0.21, 21%, times 760, or 170. So the partial pressure of gas in a mixture determines where the gas will diffuse. The rate of gas diffusion from high pressure to low pressure is determined by the steepness of the pressure gradient between the two areas. Henry's law, this is the degree to which gas dissolves in a liquid, is proportional to both its partial pressure and its solubility in liquid, and explains the behavior of gases in the air that come in contact with water in the body. Although nitrogen has a very high partial pressure in air, again, it's 78% nitrogen by volume, little nitrogen is actually found in blood plasma because the solubility in water is very low. Oxygen, on the other hand, which has a lower partial pressure in the air than nitrogen, about 21% by volume, is found dissolved in blood plasma because it is more soluble in water than nitrogen. And carbon dioxide, which has the lowest partial pressure of these gases, less than 1% in atmospheric air by volume, is also found dissolved in blood plasma as its solubility in water is 20 times greater than that of oxygen. So when we look at pulmonary gas exchange, or what we refer to as external respiration, this is respiration occurring at the level of the alveoli and the blood vessels surrounding the alveoli. This is the diffusion of gases between the alveoli and the blood. Oxygen diffuses from the air in the alveoli into blood in the pulmonary capillaries, while carbon dioxide simultaneously diffuses in the opposite direction. This converts oxygen-poor carbon dioxide-rich blood delivered to the lungs by the pulmonary artery into oxygen-rich blood with less carbon dioxide. Oxygenated blood flows through the pulmonary vein to the left atrium of the heart, where it can then be distributed to all of the tissues in the body. As with the movement of all gases, pulmonary gas exchange is driven by pressure gradients created by the difference in the partial pressures of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air and air in the alveoli and blood in the pulmonary capillaries. Blood has a low partial pressure, PO2 of 40, while in the air within the alveoli, it's 104. So the pressure gradient difference is going to favor diffusion of oxygen into the blood from the air. Again, the movement of these gases is going to be down concentration gradient. You're always going to go from higher to lower. The pressure gradient that favors the diffusion of carbon dioxide from capillary blood, which is at 45, into alveolar air, which is at 40, is not as steep, but because of its high solubility in water, you do get that movement of CO2 from the blood into the air. So here we can see gas exchange in what we call external respiration. So with external respiration, oxygen is going to move from the alveoli to the blood, CO2 is going to move from the blood to the alveoli. There are three additional factors that affect the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange besides the partial pressure and the gas solubility. And this would be the surface area of the respiratory membrane of both lungs is extremely large. It's approximately 1,000 square feet. While the quantity of blood in the pulmonary capillaries is only 75 to 100 mils. Any factor that's going to reduce the surface area and decrease the efficiency of pulmonary gas exchange could affect this. Hypoxemia, this is low blood oxygen level, which is a sign of severely impaired pulmonary gas exchange. And hypercapnemia, which is high blood carbon dioxide level, which is a sign of severely impaired pulmonary gas exchange. When we look at the thickness of the respiratory membrane, this is the distance that the gas must diffuse across. This is a very thin membrane. You don't want to have a huge barrier of allowing these gases to diffuse across. And anything that increases this thickness of the membrane, like inflammation, will actually diminish gas exchange efficiency by increasing the time it takes for the gases to diffuse. Now, there's another scenario that has to happen here, and this is what we call ventilation perfusion matching or coupling. The last factor affecting pulmonary gas exchange. This is the degree of match between the amount of air reaching the alveoli, ventilation, and the amount of blood flow, perfusion, into the pulmonary capillaries. This is a well-oiled machine where you have to have the air and the blood meeting up in their respective either blood vessels or alveoli. The two phenomena keep ventilation and perfusion closely matched or coupled. Any changes in alveolar ventilation lead to changes in perfusion. Blood flow is directed to areas with most oxygen. Changes in the efficiency of perfusion lead to changes in the amount of ventilation. Airflow is directed to areas with the most flow. So now let's talk about internal respiration. This is tissue gas exchange. And again, this is going to move down the partial pressure gradients for oxygen and CO2. Tissue gas exchange or internal respiration is an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between blood and tissues. The partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in systemic capillaries and tissues provide pressure gradients that drive diffusion of gases. Cells will use oxygen constantly for cellular respiration. So the PO2 in tissues is relatively low, while the partial pressure in systemic capillaries is high. Again, this steep pressure gradient favors the diffusion of oxygen now from the blood, where it's high, to the tissues, where it is low. Tissues produce large quantities of carbon dioxide. This is the actual waste product as a result of undergoing cellular respiration. So the partial pressure is high while it is relatively low in systemic capillaries. This pressure gradient and carbon dioxide's solubility in water favors diffusion of the gas from the tissue into the systemic capillaries. And again, what's going to happen with internal respiration is oxygen will move from the blood to the tissue, CO2 is going to move from the tissues to the blood. and that is gas exchange. The next topic, and I'll briefly go over this, is gas transport through the blood. In order for pulmonary and tissue gas exchange to occur, oxygen and carbon dioxide must undergo chemical reactions that allow for these poorly soluble gases to be transported safely in the blood. Only about 1.5% of inspired oxygen is dissolved in the blood plasma due to its relatively poor solubility. Now, CO2 is going to have much better solubility. Majority of oxygen is actually not dissolved in blood. Majority of oxygen is going to be, as we talked about with the blood chapter and red blood cells, going to be transported on a protein called hemoglobin, which is a main component of red blood cells. There are 3 ways that carbon dioxide is transported in the blood, including bicarbonate, ventilation, and carbon dioxide, which can affect the body's acid-base homeostasis balance. So let's talk about oxygen transport. Oxygen transport is facilitated by hemoglobin. And we kind of talked about hemoglobin with the red blood cells. But hemoglobin binds and releases oxygen by 2 reactions, loading and unloading. During loading, oxygen from the alveoli binds to hemoglobin in the pulmonary capillaries and converts deoxyhemoglobin to oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin that contains 1 to 3 molecules of oxygen bound is partially saturated, while hemoglobin with 4 molecules of oxygen bound is fully saturated. Once fully saturated, oxygen-rich blood travels to the left side of the heart, which pumps it to the systemic circulation. Now, during unloading, hemoglobin in systemic capillaries releases oxygen to the cells of tissues. Oxygen-poor blood returns to the right side of the heart to then be pumped back to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. So during the loading, oxygen from the alveoli bind to hemoglobin in the pulmonary capillaries, converting it to oxyhemoglobin. Oxygen-enriched blood then travels to the heart, which pumps it to the systemic circulation. During unloading, hemoglobin in the systemic capillaries releases oxygen to the tissue cells. And then what happens is now that oxygen-poor blood returns to the heart, which pumps it back to the pulmonary circulation. You repeat the whole cycle over again. The percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen is called the percent saturation. Hemoglobin saturation depends on 2 factors: the partial pressure of oxygen in both the lungs and the tissues, and the tightness or affinity or bond strength with which the hemoglobin binds to the oxygen. One of the main determinants of percent saturation of hemoglobin is the partial pressure of oxygen of blood and tissues. Higher blood PO2, the loading reaction is favored as more oxygen molecules are available to bind to hemoglobin. Lower blood oxygen, unloading reaction is favored as fewer oxygen molecules are available to bind to hemoglobin. Now let's talk about carbon dioxide transport. Carbon dioxide is generated as a waste product of cellular metabolism. It is transported from the tissues back to the lungs in 3 ways. It can be dissolved into plasma, and about 7 to 10% of CO2 is actually dissolved directly in blood plasma, which actually makes your blood plasma more of an anaerobic environment than, say, atmospheric air because of the high CO2. And remember, oxygen is only 1.5% in plasma. 20% of CO2 is actually carried on hemoglobin. Carbon dioxide binds hemoglobin's polypeptide chains, not the heme group that oxygen binds to. And this is referred to as carb-amino-hemoglobin. That still leaves about 70% of carbon dioxide. And this gets transported in the blood in the form of bicarbonate ions, which is important to the blood pH homeostasis. What happens is carbon dioxide quickly diffuses into erythrocytes where it where it encounters an enzyme referred to as carbonic anhydrase. This is an enzyme that rapidly catalyzes following a reversible reaction. So CO2 plus water gives carbonic acid. Now you can't have carbonic acid in the blood. That disassociates into what we call bicarbonate ion, which is a buffer, and hydrogen. Most bicarbonate diffuses into the blood plasma while the hydrogen binds to hemoglobin, which acts as a buffer resisting changes in pH. This would cause blood plasma to become more acidic if that did not occur. Bicarbonate carries a negative charge, counteracted by a chloride shift. Chloride ions move into the erythrocytes as bicarbonate ions move out to balance the charges. The reverse reaction occurs in erythrocytes and the pulmonary capillaries to facilitate the movement of carbon dioxide into the alveoli. Carbonic acid is reformed in erythrocytes from bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and then is converted back to water and CO2, where it then gets freely released to diffuse out of the pulmonary capillaries into the alveoli along the pressure gradients. Now, the effect of the partial pressure of CO2 on blood pH is the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is one of the primary buffer systems in the body. The buffer reaction is reversible. This allows it to respond to different physiological conditions. pH changes very little under normal circumstances. CO2 is actually a major determinant for blood levels of carbonic acid. In turn, if the partial pressure of carbon dioxide of blood is primarily determined by two factors. One, the rate and depth of ventilation, and the rate at which carbon dioxide is generated by cellular metabolic reactions. For this reason, a change in normal pattern of ventilation can have a dramatic impact on the blood concentrations of hydrogen ions. So what happens when you hyperventilate? The rate and/or depth of breathing increases. This will increase the amount of carbon dioxide expired from the lungs, decreasing the amount of CO2 in the blood. Less carbonic acid is formed, less hydrogen ions are formed, and the blood pH rises, becomes more basic. More oxygen may be dissolved in the blood as well. For hyperventilation, you would see the opposite effect. Changes in the rate and depth of ventilation can quickly compensate for sudden or dramatic changes in blood pH. Respiratory alkalosis, this can occur if hyperventilation continues, where you essentially are producing a situation where you have lack of carbon dioxide, which is going to result in an increase of pH or the blood becoming too basic. Respiratory acidosis, on the other hand, is when you're hypoventilating and you are actually increasing your CO2 levels, causing the pH to decrease. So here we can see carbon dioxide transports during normal ventilation versus and how you're able to maintain normal pH, and then what happens during hyperventilation, hypoventilation. Okay. The final topic is going to be control of ventilation. So breathing usually occurs without conscious thought or control. Disease or homeostatic imbalances that affect the respiratory system make breathing more of a challenge. Dyspnea, feeling of shortness of breath, this can actually be caused by many different reasons. Eupnea, this is normal breathing, one of the most vital functions the body carries out, as lack of breathing can lead to death. The control of breathing by neurons is found in the brainstem, specialized cells that detect and monitor the carbon dioxide levels. Believe it or not, it's carbon dioxide levels over oxygen levels that would trigger a change in ventilation. But you're also going to monitor your proton levels, which could affect the acidity of the blood, as well as oxygen levels. Negative feedback loops and stretch receptors in the lungs also ensure oxygen intake and carbon dioxide elimination will match that of metabolic requirements. The medulla, which is part of the brainstem, this is the region of the brain that controls ventilation. Neurons in the pons will influence respiratory rhythm, but they are not responsible for maintaining eupnea, or normal rate of breathing. However, we have what's called the respiratory rhythm generator. This is a group of neurons that generates or creates a basic rhythm for breathing. It's found within the structure called the ventral respiratory column. Neurons found in the medullary reticular formation assist the respiratory rhythm generator, known as the ventral or dorsal respiratory groups. The ventral respiratory group is found in the anterior and lateral portions of the medulla and contains both inspiratory and expiratory neurons. And these will affect those various muscles, the diaphragm or your intercostals. Both nerves also supply accessory muscles that are involved in inspiration and expiration. The intercostal nerves and the phrenic nerve, which innervates the diaphragm. The dorsal respiratory group is found in the posterior medulla, and this is primarily involved with inspiration, sending impulses along the same pathways, the diaphragm and the intercostals, as the ventral respiratory group. However, the dorsal respiratory group may also integrate sensory information from blood and lungs and then relay that to the ventral respiratory group. And here you can see the various control mechanisms, whether they're autonomic or voluntary control mechanisms for ventilation. So I just also want to mention a few other things. As far as gas is being carried on the red blood cells. The red blood cells have pretty high affinity for oxygen to bind. However, there is another gas that has a much higher affinity to binding than oxygen does, and that is carbon monoxide. And unfortunately, what happens is if you are exposed to carbon monoxide, it will actually preferentially bind to hemoglobin over oxygen. And when it binds, it holds on extremely tight, and it's very tough to get it to release. So what ends up happening with people that have carbon monoxide poisoning is you end up in a situation where their hemoglobin molecules are slowly being filled in by these carbon monoxide molecules. And what happens is the patients actually slowly start to suffocate to death. Okay, and that is it for the respiratory system, and that is also it for exam 2.